can't avoid it. You can't not be in it. Hamas destroyed Gaza before the war, and Hezbollah today is destroying Lebanon. We face enemies who destroy themselves. Vulnerability is part of it, and vulnerable people come together. There was a sense of solidarity and of coming together. And then October 7 happened.
How do you make it not worthwhile to hold Israeli hostages? How do you make that cost so massive that it doesn't make sense anymore?
It's very simple.
Oh, man. Well, that's how I wanted to start this off, by asking how the family was, because we talked last year around this time, a little about a month off. So about 11 months ago is when we spoke last. And I sincerely appreciate you taking the time then and taking the time now. And I wanted to ask you how your family is doing and how your sphere of friends and family are doing.
It's been a heck of a year. It's we've been trying to have a detached sort of home. The home, the kids. My youngest started the year at 4. She's now 5. We don't want her to be in the sort of general atmosphere of the country. Of course, you can't hide it from them. You can't hide anything from them. Half the dads on my street put on a uniform and went off for 4 months to war. So. But we have, I think, managed to maintain a home that is happy, sort of relaxed. Life is disrupted, but these are also COVID kids, so they came out of COVID and then went into this year. I don't know if they know that their life is disrupted. In other words, it's just life is kind of just something that's very sort of topsy-turvy for them. So we've been doing that. We had a good, family friend who was killed in the war over the last 11 months. We've had families come forward. My wife was very close to one family that had 8 members of the family taken hostage. One is still a hostage, and 7 of them, including a 4-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy, were released in November in that very first hostage deal. So because my wife was part of the group of volunteers that helped that family, including helped their sort of global PR campaign, they were trying to create pressure. I think the grandparents of the family have some foreign citizenship, so they tried to reach out to some foreign governments. Anyway, other families have now come forward that she's been helping and working with. So we're close to it. We're attached to it. It's been crazy. Journalism is flourishes the more humans suffer. So our newspaper did very well in COVID and has done very well in this war, but we're all working to the bone. And so I guess it's been an exhausting year. You can't avoid it. You can't not be in it. And the best you can do is keep the kids away from it and, soldier on.
Yeah. I wonder if this generation that grew up knowing COVID first and then this war second will have parallels to the generation in the United States that went through the Great Depression and then into World War II, and everyone had to sacrifice something, whether it's giving their tires from their cars so that the war effort can use that rubber, to putting up blackout curtains all over the house, and or knew someone or said goodbye to a brother or a father going off to war. I wonder if there'll be parallels between this generation in Israel living through this and that generation in the United States that essentially built the United States into what we are today.
All right, this is Jack Carr checking in, and I'm so fired up to introduce you to the SIG Sauer P226 40th Anniversary Edition pistol. As you can tell, the 226 is my favorite pistol. It was on my side for every single deployment downrange, and even when I had to put my long gun aside to go into a meeting or go somewhere where I couldn't take my body armor and my long gun, that 226 was on my side. Right here, retro packaging. Let's check this thing out. 226 40th anniversary edition. Look at this. And this is exactly the same way that it was delivered back in the 80s. Retro styling here on the packaging. Absolutely love this pistol. Thank you guys, everybody at Sig Sauer, for everything that you've done for me, the United States military, and 40th anniversary edition pistol. Awesome.
The BCM AT Angular Torque Optic Mount. Twice the clamping force at the rail. Unprecedented zero retention. Less points of failure. The BCM Raider modular rail for AR rifles is built using a double wall extrusion, creating one of the most rigid free-floating platforms in its weight class. BCM Raider offers Picatinny rails and features either M-LOK or KeyMod interfaces at 3, 6, and 9 o'clock for the placement of additional enabling accessories. Go to BravoCompanyUSA.com and get yours today. Thank you to Bravo Company Manufacturing for your support of military law enforcement and the Danger Close podcast.
Well, I think that's the key, right? They are people who knew that life is precious and vulnerability is part of it. And vulnerable people come together, and people who understand the fragility of things, it makes them stronger. And so I'm not afraid for this generation of Israelis, for my kids. I think my kids are learning from their surroundings to be strong. You know, they hear that there's this regime over in a place called Iran that, even though it doesn't have a border with us and no interest in this place, for some reason wants to destroy us. And they're growing up into a world in which they understand that they need each other and they need to be strong. And that's it's a blessing. I don't want the war for them ever, but that strength is a blessing.
Yeah. And before we get into, I want to ask you about some recent events with hostage negotiations, unfortunate hostage executions, and judicial reform, some recent assassinations outside Israel's borders. But before I get to that, for people who didn't listen to our first podcast, can you give a quick rundown on your path into journalism, and then maybe a couple of the challenges that have come up over the last year being a journalist in this environment?
Sure. I'm born and raised in Jerusalem. Some significant part of my childhood was in the States. That's where the English is from. Then I went to the army, as Israelis at 18 do. I was in the infantry. I came out of the army and went to college. For 3 years or so, I worked as a security guard or bodyguard for government ministers, just because that's the only student job you can get out of the army. And then I saw an ad in a newspaper, an English language newspaper, basically for a spell checker. I have extremely good spelling. I mean, in 6th grade, I think I got second place in my school at the spelling bee in the US.
Hey, not bad.
Yeah, and I was a foreign kid, in Israel, I'm Olympic level, so I got the job, and I really kind of started right at the bottom. And for an Israeli, I have excellent English, but for English speaking journalists, I'm sometimes the guy in the room with the best Hebrew, just because my Hebrew is native. And so I became education reporter and reporter for Tel Aviv, the Tel Aviv area, because these are beats that require a lot of Hebrew. Unlike diplomatic beat, where everything essentially happens in English anyway. And I rose through the ranks. I mostly dealt with politics, Israeli politics, but you can't deal with Israeli politics without dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, how Israeli society is divided, Jewish-Arab relations, religious-secular relations, all of the sort of complicated stuff in this country. It all comes to a head in the political system. And so that's it. I've been in journalism. I mean, it's really all I've ever done. It's my brief mandatory military career and then journalism. And now I am an analyst of Israeli politics, but also of the larger conflict. yeah, I guess that it's not an exciting story. I have good things to
That is an
tell, but
exciting story. You just
the
tell it
career
so
path is
with such calm and but that's an amazing story, especially in a place like Israel. It's so dynamic that is surrounded by enemies on all sides. That from the outside looking in has a political system that is very confusing with the Knesset and it's just there's so much going on there. So it does sound it sounds exciting to me. Uh, but uh, bringing us up, well, before I get to the specifics of, I want to talk about the Philadelphia corridor, what that is, why that's strategically important, what that means to Hamas, what it means to Israel, what it means to hostage negotiations. Before we get to that, what has the last year been like for citizens of Israel? And I hate to do that generally, of course, but Israel is a small country. And like I said, obviously surrounded by enemies. What has life been like? And how has it changed from September 6th to October 6th to October 8th? What has changed in Israel over this last year?
I think the fundamental thing is that we thought for a good, I guess, 15 years that the big wars were basically over and we were safe. And we had enemies and we had problems, big problem. You know, the Palestinian issue is enormous, and it's also an issue where we owe the Palestinians answers. It's not that we're the right guys and they're just an enemy. The Israeli political left and really the Israeli ability to withdraw, to offer serious offers was destroyed essentially in the Second Intifada in 2000, where as the soldiers are pulling out, there are no Israeli soldiers in any Palestinian city. They're talking about negotiating. They're negotiating shared sovereignty on the Temple Mount over at Camp David with Bill Clinton and everything. Everybody thinks that there's a peace coming, and then we get hit by 140 suicide bombings, which is a kind of scale of attack that I don't know. Pick an issue dividing America in a culture war and add in 140 suicide bombings. You know, if immigration is an issue that hurts America, I don't mean to get canceled, but it's the only thing I have to tell you is try to convey the sense of imagine a immigrant from Mexico walking into a teenager's bar, a non-alcoholic. We have non-alcoholic bars for teenagers. There's usually alcohol in them, but don't tell anybody that. But walking into a bar for teenagers and blowing himself up and killing 24 kids, and then um, telling everyone it's because of America's terrible and I don't know what abusive immigration policy. And then the next week another one, and then three more a week later, and then 13 over the next month, and then 140 over 3 years. What would be left of the capacity of the left, of the right, mostly of the left, to even talk about immigrations properly, to even think about it, to say, this is something that right? The furthest left of American politics would want to build a big wall. You know what I mean? It's the shock, and so Israelis lost faith in the capacity to solve the Palestinian problem. And it's actually an astonishing thing. We had a historic drop in voter turnout in elections after that second intifada because there was this loss of faith in politics. And then began basically 20 years after the Second Lebanon War of 2006, which sort of confirmed we pulled out of South Lebanon after 18 years, very similar to the Afghanistan experience in America. We pulled out of Gaza in 2005. And those are the two places that then attack us mercilessly and brutally with with the rocket strikes. And so it turns out that even we can't stay, we don't have a bilateral peace on offer because their politics are so dysfunctional and extreme. And then most Israelis conclude from 2006, the Second Lebanon War. If I'm speaking Chinese here to people, just Wikipedia is your friend. You can fill in all these gaps, but we conclude that we can't withdraw. And so most Israelis have sort of for the last 16 years, 2006, 18 years, just kind of coasted. And over the period of the last 18 years, when we've just kind of, coasted without making dramatic peace processes, dramatic withdrawals, dramatic conquests, dramatic wars of any kind, our GDP per capita doubled. We are wealthier per person now than New Zealand. We're wealthier per person now than Britain. And so we were going from success to success. Our enemies, you know, Hamas destroyed Gaza before the war. And Hezbollah today is destroying Lebanon. And there's no Israeli blockade that's making it do it. The United States keeps trying to save Lebanon, keeps trying to prop up the Lebanese economy, keeps trying to work with the Lebanese central bank. There's nothing you can do to fix Lebanon that will repair fast enough what Hezbollah is demolishing in Lebanon. And so we face enemies who destroy themselves. What the Houthis have done to Yemen, no enemy of Yemen has ever done to Yemen. And we are safe and we are happy and we are free and we are a democratic country that's basically competent. We have a lot of fights in our politics, but we also have universal health care and we live longer than most, I believe, French people and certainly longer than Americans on average. You know, we're a country that America does some things amazingly well that we do badly. America does some things badly that we do amazingly well. We're a competent Western country. And then October 7 happened, and we discovered that we were not free from the wars. Our military is extraordinary in many ways, but is also sometimes incompetent in the way militaries every war are astonished and surprised that the enemy had, wasn't fighting the last war, right? And we discovered that we are vulnerable, and we discovered that we need each other, and we discovered that our enemies are willing. We looked at them and said, "Look, they're destroying themselves. That's weakness. That's incompetence." And then we discovered on October 7 that their willingness to destroy themselves in order to destroy us, because they have this grand religious redemption vision, was their strength. And so we now face, Palestinians in Gaza look at Israel and see this powerful enemy and this powerful thing and feel very vulnerable. Israelis look at this vast array of proxies of Iran. Hamas is not quite a proxy of Iran, but it's embedded in that proxy structure. On 6 of our borders, committed to our absolute extermination and feel vulnerable. And so we're back in history. We're back from that little vacation, and we have to face these enemies, and we have to be strong. We have to be united, and we have to be dangerous. 2 things happened. One, the trauma of October 7 filtered through our society, changed how we talk, how we think, how we look at the region. And 2, in the probably 2-3 months after October 7, polls asking Israelis about optimism went up. Israelis went to this war with a unity of purpose. There was a figure coming out of the army. I hope I have that right. It was 18% of the reserve call-up of something like 300,000 men. It was the biggest reserve call-up in the history of the country. 18% were high-tech employees. And that's incredibly overrepresented for the industry. Israel's very high-tech, and the high-tech industry is a major engine of the economy, but it's about 9% of the salaried workforce. So they're about double overrepresented in the military. The high-tech industry also votes left in Israel, quite dramatically. And so the left was in this war right alongside the right. And the religious were in this war right alongside the secular. And the Bedouin, Hamas on October 7 killed 50 Israeli Arabs. And among the hostages is an 18-year-old young woman, Aisha, who, we have not heard from and probably is not alive. The Bedouin of the South, who serve in the Israeli army, those soldiers, as they went off to that war, put out music videos about coming for Hamas, about their absolute commitment. There was a sense of solidarity and of coming together that crossed political and cultural and religious and ethnic lines that aren't usually crossed in the Middle East. And that unity, happiness in life is not about the challenges you face. It's about the support, the social capital, the knowledge that if you fall, someone will pick you up. And Israelis felt that. Morale was high, and the desire to remove this threat of Hamas permanently, was high. We can talk about what happened after. I mean, that morale has in some ways collapsed. The political fights are all back. 11 months is a long time. But the last year has been a rediscovery of something very fundamental for Israelis, which is that we lean on each other or we fall. And that sense of unity is really powerful. I mean, it's really powerful. There's families on my street who've given a lot more to this war effort than anything we've given. And for two of them this week, I'm cooking dinner. You know what I mean? There's a list of all the neighbors. I'm not special, right? Everyone's taking care of everyone in every neighborhood in the country. Um, so we've discovered our unity. We've rediscovered our unity alongside all of the difficulties of this past year.
And trust levels has the trust between, let's say, average Israeli citizen and not the frontline soldier, not the junior officer, not the enlisted, but with senior level leadership in the military and intelligence circles. Because certainly before September 11th, or sorry, from October 7th, from the outside looking in, there was this aura of not invincibility, but close to it when you looked at Israel's history and the history of the defense forces and the intelligence services. And for that part of the globe, it looked like, wow, Israel, no one can touch Israel. Look at this history. Look at what they do. Look at how they keep these enemies at bay. And then October 7th happens. What has the last year been like as far as trust from the average Israeli who's looking up at and looking at leadership in the military and intelligence circles? Has it waned and gone up and down? When you look at, I won't say a stagnation, but if you look at how long this has taken, was the expectation that Israel would go in and crush Hamas in a matter of weeks and months, and now here we are at 11 months, and there's been recent executions of hostages, there's political fighting, but what is that trust like between Israelis and those the defense forces at those senior leadership levels and the intelligence services?
I think the anger is profound. The revelations that have come out since then of the sheer amount, and you know, it's always this way when you have a terrible intelligence failure. But nevertheless, the revelations that individual soldiers on the ground, um, spotters were reporting these movements and that they were unusual and that there were junior officers who said something big is happening. And the director of military intelligence, a major general, personally killed those notices because he thought that's definitely not what's happening and he's not going to listen to some captain or major. And that that the publicizing of those revelations, and we've already had some internal army investigations into what happened and some general sort of journalistic investigations and all of that. And so we know a very great amount of what happened. Some of it was one of the really extraordinary things to come out of this is that female soldiers, combat soldiers, in female majority combat units. It was a slow process of women getting into combat roles in the IDF, and it was a process that was not speeding up. They held back those Hamas fighters better than some of the positions with only male soldiers. And a lot of the spotters, a lot of the people sitting on the cameras are female soldiers. And there is I think, widely held belief, I tend to share it, that one of the reasons that higher level intelligence officers didn't take seriously enough their reporting was that they were women. And there was a, you know, the upper echelons are all men. That is something that people have started there's no more discussion. There used to be a big debate about can women be in the army at the same level as men in most roles. That is not a discussion anyone has anymore. And part of it was a sense that look who was the competent one on right in the when a surprise happened, who recovered faster, who was warning about it a minute before instead of a minute after. There have been a lot of calls for resignations. The top political leadership has avoided allowing major resignations because they're afraid that if generals start resigning, naturally there'll be a call for them to start resigning, right? If the head of the army has to resign, why not the defense minister, who is also a former general and who also was very involved in building out the sort of strategic concept of containment in Gaza that failed so spectacularly. And it was the fundamental strategy toward Gaza of Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister. So if the defense minister and the chief of staff, why not, right? And so there's been an avoidance of that. I think the reckoning will come. The reckoning is unavoidable. And what these individuals hope, I believe, is that they will be able to fix the problem in such a way that when that public reckoning comes, when the history books are written, they won't only have the disaster to their names, they'll also be the ones who fixed it and then went home. So that's kind of the dynamic. I have to say, Israelis don't forgive, but they are not obsessing about that question of responsibility and fault and resignations. Um, the decline in morale and the decline in the belief that we were going to win in Gaza, and we've seen this decline. It used to be that, I don't know, 80, sometimes 90% would say definitely we're going to win in Gaza. And now it's below half. And what's fascinating is when you parse out, sort of you talk to Israelis, or you have qualitative surveys, meaning you have long interviews with people, and you ask them why don't you think Gaza is going to go well? Um, it's not the soldiers, it's not the military campaign itself. There is a faith that it'll take a long time. It's degrading a guerrilla force, right? The U.S., with its allies on the ground, kicked ISIS out of northern Iraq over 5 years. And that included some immense and devastating and sort of spectacular, in the sense that it was huge and a spectacle, not in the sense that it was good, urban battles like in Mosul in 2016. But it was a 5-year degradation of this force. And that was when the local population was on America's side, right? And not on the guerrilla side. And that's not true in Gaza. The huge numbers of Gazans hope Hamas will be gone at the end of the war, more than half, and somewhere between 60 and 70%, depending on the polls. But that leaves a huge chunk that supports them and wants them to win. And so all of these problems, Israelis understand. When they express a lack of faith in the war effort, it's politics. There's a sense that our politicians, every Israeli population, every Israeli, subgroup, subculture, religious or Jewish or Arab or any group in Israel, experienced October 7 and experienced the past year with all the rest. It was a tremendously unifying thing, except for one group, which was our politicians. I have been connected to some of these, my wife mostly, not me so much, but accompanying these families affected by October 7. There's one family who managed to get a meeting with the Chancellor of Germany before a junior Israeli minister would meet with them. There's a kibbutz, Nir Oz, on the Gaza border. A quarter of its population was killed or taken hostage on October 7, and they have invited the prime minister, and the prime minister hasn't gone. And the reason is that we have a political class that in the good times, when everybody thought that we were safe, played this kind of very populist modern politics where you sort of, you lie your way through everything and you don't need to be responsible. The economy's doing well, everything's going hunky-dory, the army knows how to keep us safe. And they didn't switch. That didn't turn into, and now we're at war and we need to explain to the people what is happening. So Netanyahu has gone 3 months at a time without any media interview in Israel. He's gone on American podcasts, but not here. I don't want to talk about our politicians' failures. The only reason it's important is for one small reason. The sense that the war is led by people who are prioritizing their politics is the only part of this that Israelis are experiencing as weakness. In other words, that is where we struggle. And our politicians can fix it tomorrow. They can fix it tonight. In other words, they can stand up and they can talk to Israelis about the war effort, about sacrifices. They can put aside coalition spending. The way it works in a parliamentary coalition system is that you have multiple parties forming together a parliamentary majority and they run the government. They form the government from within parliament. And Netanyahu, to keep these different parties, ultra-Orthodox parties, some right-wing parties, there are 5 different parties in his coalition, and to keep them all happy, one of the things that coalitions do is that they spend money on their constituencies, and that's why you want to be in the government, and that's why you vote for the government, etc. That coalition spending has gone up, even as the defense budget doubled and the country is tilting into recession, because Netanyahu is more afraid that they will leave his side and his government will fall. So to irresponsibly run a wartime economy, to hold his government together, his political position together, and to be seen by so many of the victims and the families and the half of Israel that didn't vote for this government as literally just ignoring what they went through, has been our one weakness. Has been our one weakness. I'll just say one thing because you said something very important, the sense that it's gone on for very, very long. Back in November, the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, gave Israelis a sense of the scale, of the time scale. And he said there would be the first phase would be the airstrikes that attempted to get to those tunnels without a ground invasion. They were a complete failure, and Palestinian civilian deaths were very high, and no Hamas guys were killed because Hamas was hiding in those tunnels. And by the way, in 11 months of war, not a single civilian has been allowed to step foot in any tunnel, right? The purpose of those tunnels is for Hamas to survive while the civilians die. That's the war strategy. And so that first stage was a failure. And then we started the ground operation. And Gallant said that ground operation will take, I forget what it was, 6 to 12 months, something like that. We're in month 11 now. And then there'll be phase 3. And phase 3 is, different words have been used, guerrilla, counterinsurgency, degradation of Hamas over time. And that could be a year, that could be 3 years. Nobody really knows. So schedule-wise, the war is on schedule. I'm very frustrated at certain moments. There was about a 3-month delay between February and April, mainly because of American pressure that we did not go into Rafah. We did not take the Philadelphia corridor. And I'm very frustrated at my government for not resisting that pressure and doing it anyway, because I don't think the Biden administration would have, bombed us or something. I don't think that would have. In the end, we did it against the Biden administration's wishes and nothing happened. In fact, for 3 months, we discovered Palestinian civilians, Israeli hostages, soldiers on the ground, all just stood around suffering for no reason because there was just bad planning from far away in our government that didn't, resist some of those pressures when they were less wise than they could have been. So long story short, the war has gone well on the ground militarily. There are a lot of other aspects that we can talk about, but militarily, it is not delayed in any extreme way. These are the timescales on which these kinds of wars have to be fought. And the only real sense that Israelis have when they talk about losing faith in the war effort or in the possibility of victory, they're never talking about the actual military effort. They're always talking about our own domestic politics.
Interesting. And I do want to ask you about Rafah and Philadelphia corridor, the tunnels going into Egypt. I want to talk about that in a minute. But is there in Israel, is there something that's like we had after 9/11 with the 9/11 Commission report, the Iraq Survey Study Group, whatever that was kind of earlier on in the Iraq war. After Iran-Contra, we had the Tower Commission report. A very bad example is the Warren Commission report after the Kennedy assassination. That should have been really called the Dulles Commission report, but that is also another story. Is there something like that in Israel where there will be an accounting, a collection of lessons learned, an explanation to the Israeli people from an official standpoint? Is something like that in the works, or has something like that been done?
So historically, there have been. After the 73 war, the Agranat Commission, the Khan Commission, there have been many of these, usually chaired by a Supreme Court justice, and then the members of the committee or represent either the political system, the professional class, different groups. The government's very good at that. The Israeli state is very good at that and uses those reports and often, not always, but often learns from them. After the Second Lebanon War, the Vinograd Commission. And here's the thing. Apropos trust, the government is refusing to establish the highest level possible of a commission, a state commission, and wants to establish a government commission, which is a commission answerable to the minister that appoints the commission, much more junior, and a commission whose report is submitted to the minister and isn't necessarily, publicized, isn't necessarily empowered to take apart every institution, right? If you have a state commission of inquiry chaired by a Supreme Court justice or some very senior, either judicial official or elected official, they also have the highest security clearance. And so they can also really, crack open the intelligence and the different services and who said what to who behind closed doors. And the government is fighting tooth and nail. The prime minister is fighting tooth and nail not to allow that kind of a commission to be established. And so it hasn't been established. The public argument is that has to wait till after the war. It'll hurt the war effort. The people that would be investigated are the people managing the war. The response of critics is, well, maybe the people who need to be investigated shouldn't be managing the war. I don't want to get into that debate. I'm not sure the government is wrong in terms of the delay. I am sure the government is wrong in terms of the level of the commission that has to be established. And it just shows the extent to which there's so much politics and there's so many people trying to survive rather than stepping aside with dignity and saying, the people need this and the nation needs this. And so there's a lot of distrust. There's distrust among Israelis toward their leaders in the one moment where you really need trust, because we have leaders who are making decisions about whether hostages live or die, decisions they have to make, decisions that are going to mean people die. In other words, the cost of releasing hostages is dead soldiers, and the cost of not releasing those hostages because you want the war effort to be sustained in a certain way is dead hostages. And that is their duty to make those decisions. And thank God I don't have to do that. And I respect them for having that problem. But you can't do it without trust. You can't do it without the public thinking you're not campaigning on people's lives. You're actually leading and making tough decisions. So that is our struggle. And the question of the commission, it's going to come up because of this resistance from the politicians. A lot of the families of hostages and some critics of the government have established what they call the civilian or civil commission of inquiry. And they have brought very respected, former generals and judges and things like that. And they formed this committee, and they're actually interviewing openly, publicly, broadcasting live testimony from very important officials and people who were involved, are involved. And a lot of people are showing up to give testimony. And so there's a kind of civilian reconciliation process happening outside the government, independent of the government, because there's so much sort of just despair, just giving up on the government actually behaving in ways that unify and build that trust. I have to say, I think that most of the actual decisions made by this government in this war were good. I'm not actually a critic of the latest decision on Philadelphia that sparked, 200,000 people to protest. I agree with the government's decision on Philadelphia. I am frustrated and angry that these politicians refuse to do what it takes to build the kind of trust it takes for the country to walk behind them toward, when they make these extremely painful decisions. So I'm not criticizing the government's handling of the war. I'm criticizing their handling of the country. And I think that that's an important part of fighting a war is sustaining morale.
Certainly. And I want to ask you specifically about the Philadelphia corridor. Before I do, just to set it up, really what the United States ended up doing in Iraq and Afghanistan was an expeditionary counterinsurgency, meaning not something within our own borders. And from the outside looking in, when I look at Israel and Gaza, and I see it's expeditionary in a sense, but it's also domestic in a sense, in that you're right there. There's a border there. There used to be shared people used to go across all the time, back and forth. So it's kind of a morph of domestic counterinsurgency and expeditionary counterinsurgency, just because of the dividing line there. But in an insurgency, for those listening, something that's very important is a place to rest and refit, to have rat lines that brings in food and water and ammunition and intelligence and all these things. And Hamas has that through Philadelphia corridor into Egypt in a tunnel system. So first off, why is it called the Philadelphia corridor? And I would encourage everybody listening to this to actually look at a map, look at Israel, look at Egypt, look at Lebanon, look at Gaza, the West Bank, just get an understanding of where these things are, because geography plays such a huge role, really in all wars and in all geopolitics. But what is the Philadelphia corridor, and why is it so important and valuable to Hamas?
A lot of Israelis have been asking, what is the source of that name? I'll tell you what I have always known, and I have been unable to trace the exact, by the time the Israelis and the Egyptians signed an agreement in 2006, after the withdrawal, it was called the Philadelphia Agreement. But it's been called that from the 60s. When a military moves into a space or controls a space, it gives special names in its code maps to the different routes, the roads and the dirt roads and various routes that it uses. And partly that's to confuse the enemy. That doesn't last very long. The enemy figures out the names. But partly it's also to keep the names very, very different sounding, because when you speak over a radio, the speech is garbled, and so you need names to sound very different so you don't confuse forces and sending down the wrong route. So you can't say a and hey and I don't know what,
Go or
Trey,
no?
go or no, right?
Go,
And
yeah, that's a
right,
big
and
one.
that's where Alpha Bravo, right, Delta, that's where that kind of talk is from. It's to make things extremely different from all other things. And Philadelphia was that code name of that route. But I don't know why, and I'm not 100% sure that's all there is to it. But it's an Israeli usage that has been adopted just for convenience sake by everyone else. The point of that corridor is that it is the Gaza-Egypt border, and underneath it there were something like 150 tunnels, and some of them were big enough to drive a truck through. And in fact, trucks were driven through them every single day. And so Hamas, even as Israeli forces advanced, beginning from the north to the south, so that we wouldn't create, Battle of the Bulge type surround forces, Hamas kept resupplying and could flee the battlefield over through those tunnels. And Egyptian officials, corrupt Egyptian officials, made millions, tens of millions of US dollars over the years in allowing and facilitating that smuggling and that sort of supply route. And I think it's true also on the Israeli side, right? It's the counterinsurgency. It's not expeditionary in the simple sense that the artillery cover is from within Israel, right? So it's very, very close, right? These are battles happening at very, very close range. And basically the story of the Philadelphia corridor is that if we don't cut that supply line to Hamas, then it will constantly be resupplying. It will be able to, if it thinks that some member of Hamas is a high value target, that person can flee Gaza, not just the battlefield. It took us 8 months to go in. We didn't go in until May. I think there are reasons that was delayed some months. It was delayed 8 months because I think of a bad strategy and international pressure, primarily American pressure. In May, we went in. And since May, Hamas's ability to fight has been massively degraded. Their ability to produce, their ability to just make Israeli soldiers die has been massively degraded. And we have systematically been destroying those tunnels And so the supplies to Hamas have gone down. And Hamas's need to come above ground to get supplies, steal essentially aid from civilians has gone up. And we've been able to catch them more. And they've reestablished themselves in a few places because one of the Israeli lessons from Afghanistan, from the US experience in Afghanistan, was not to hold, right? There was this idea of clear and hold. You send forces into a place, they stay there so that the Taliban can't retake. But what ended up happening, this is Americans taught us this. I'm not telling you something new, but what ended up happening was creating a lot of targets for the guerrilla forces all over the country. And so there's no holding in Gaza. And that also serves our needs. We don't want to go into tunnels. We don't want to have our soldiers walk into their booby traps, and we don't want the hostages killed that are held in those tunnels. And so every time Hamas comes out, we have a chance to have now a new battle with Hamas above ground where we have the advantages. And just, I know some of your listeners have military background, I'm led to believe. So one of the interesting doctrines to develop out of Gaza is just purely from a military tactical point of view is the second, what's it called? The second entry doctrine, which is that the first time you enter an area where Hamas forces operate significantly and are expecting you. Hamas spent 17 years building the tunnel network into this immense, right? It's hundreds of miles. It's by far the biggest thing Palestinians have ever built. It's by far the biggest military combat tunnel system ever built. And it's done in a very small place, and all of it tracking under civilian populations. None of these tunnels go off right under fields or places where you could just bomb them with bunker busters. The point of this tunnel system was to force the enemy, any enemy, they were preparing it obviously for Israel, but any enemy coming for Hamas to cut through the civilian population, to cut through the cities. Everything we can do to pull them out of those tunnels, either because of hunger, thirst, they can't supply through tunnels into more tunnels through Philadelphia, anything we can do to force them above ground, to have the battle above ground, forces them to secure the above ground. They prepared those tunnels. They'd also prepared lookouts, booby-trapped streets and buildings, and massive fortifications in all kinds of different areas in urban spaces in Gaza. The first time the Israeli army goes into a place like that, it actually has to trigger all those bombs. It actually has to detonate them before they detonate on the soldiers. It actually has to find all the snipers and traps and things. The second time, Hamas has no capacity to lay those booby traps again, to build the battlefield again. And so the second time is an incredibly easy battle. So for example, the first time there was a battle at Shifa Hospital, where the underground of Shifa was a major command center of Hamas. The first battle took a month. And Israeli soldiers were dying, not just Hamas fighters. And because it took so long, they also had a lot of time to escape with extremely valuable intelligence and equipment. The second time, the Hamas had come back. They believed they were immune. There was a lot of world attention on this question of besieging a hospital, and a lot of anger, and the Israelis wouldn't do it. And the Israeli command went out, and I think it was 20 minutes. Within 20 minutes, the Hamas forces in the hospital were facing a massive, gun battle assault by Israel. 200 Hamas fighters killed, 500 taken prisoner in a matter of hours. And so the first siege is a month. The second is 6 hours. Clear out, force them to come back in and hold, and then constantly have this degradation battle where they have to come above ground. In other words, make the tunnels work against them, not for them, is kind of how this is going. And it's going slow, but steady. And Hamas is slowly being demolished basically in that way.
And between October and May, when you look at a map, and let's say you look at Afghanistan, and you can see quite obviously that there are rat lines, resupply routes into Pakistan. And there's a border that both sides don't even recognize anyway. You look at Iraq and you see Syria and Iran, and you see rat lines there. We do a very poor job of cutting those rat lines off, regardless of how much we tried. But you look at a map of Israel and Gaza, and you can see that there is a much better opportunity to cut off Hamas from the outside, just geographically. But of course, that key is that Philadelphia corridor going in to Egypt. The other side is pretty much Israel can control the flow of things in and out for the most part, or better than one could in Afghanistan with that border, and in Iraq in that border. So what do you think the U.S. pressure was for? Why do you think that Netanyahu specifically, or the Israeli government as a whole, kind of bowed to that pressure? I can think of a couple reasons. Maybe negotiations that could get hostages out, perhaps into Egypt somehow, as some sort of deals. Like, I can think of that. I can think of maybe intelligence sources on both sides, but I'm not sure. But why would it take so long to cut off something that is so key and so valuable to Hamas earlier on?
Part of it I understand completely, and part of it I don't, and I'm extremely frustrated about. The part I understand completely was the thing that they said openly. Civilians. Gazan civilians have suffered terribly, terribly, terribly. This is a kind of war in which the war was meant to come to the civilians. There have been, I don't know the number, it's somewhere on the order of 30,000 Israeli airstrikes. Some of them have gone wrong, terribly, badly wrong. That's how 30,000 airstrikes work. And you know, in other words, if you assume the best of Israelis, the civilians in Gaza are still suffering terribly. A lot of the moral panic created around the world, some of it is justified, a lot of it is not. There's Gazans have been, according to reports in the Western press, have been suffering from a famine for 11 straight months. But they're not dying of hunger. There isn't a famine in Gaza. There is, by the way, an actual famine in Sudan right now, and that doesn't interest anyone. And it doesn't interest anyone because it doesn't fit narratives. It's not a sort of sellable conflict. I say that in quotes because I think it's a horrifying thing. But all of that exaggeration of the suffering doesn't mean there isn't immense suffering. Huge numbers of Gazans know someone who died or experienced themselves, family members, or are wounded, or know someone who's wounded. And in the best case scenario, you're talking about a family that has been shuttling between tent encampments as a war comes to every place where they were, because that's where Hamas is now shooting from, and the Israelis are moving in, and the Israelis are willing to move in everywhere. And so that's the best case scenario. It's been a terrible, horrible experience of real suffering. And the American administration has faced both genuine, decent people, horrified at that suffering, and also a lot of the dishonest campaign that exaggerated it and also somehow suggested that this is the first time in the history of warfare where civilians suffered, or that makes war illegal if civilians suffer. There were 5 figures death toll in Mosul in that battle, and Iraq is grateful to America for having dislodged ISIS from Mosul. And so that's what war is, and it's horrifying. And I'm glad people see war. It's a shame they only see war when it fits their politics, because there are a lot of other wars where if they saw them, maybe there would have been less war. But the American administration, because of the political pressure it faced from within the Democratic Party, because the election was coming up, and because also of the real decent people genuinely thinking that there was too much suffering and a lot of it could be alleviated, didn't want us to go into Rafah, where 1 million civilians were sheltering. And there were these conversations. The Israeli National Security Council met the American National Security Council. And this is from news reports. I wasn't there. I don't know this firsthand. But apparently they had this meeting in which the American officials said to the Israelis, you can't go into Rafah if you can't move. Rafah is the city that straddles the Philadelphia corridor. In other words, half of Rafah is Palestinian in Gaza. Half of the city of Rafah is actually Egypt. It's inside the Egyptian border. And the city just literally straddles, and most of those tunnels go through Rafah from an Egyptian neighborhood to a Palestinian neighborhood. You can't go into Rafah without moving the 1.2, 1.4, there aren't even good numbers, million civilians sheltering there. And the Israelis believe that they could move those civilians in 6 weeks or in 4 weeks, excuse me. And the Americans said it would take 4 months. And when that sort of made the Israeli press, a lot of Israelis started scratching their heads because Gaza's not that big. It doesn't take 4 months. By the way, in the end, the Israelis in May went in, and in 12 days, they were all moved. The idea that it would take 4 months is just, I don't know it's incompetent is what it is. I read that, and we had these discussions in Israel among the press, and I was in podcasts and news, panels. And the only thing I could imagine was that in the National Security Council, there's a map on the wall of the Ukraine war and a map on the wall of the Gaza war. And because the maps are the same size, they think the countries might be the same size. I can't, I'm making fun of them. I apologize. I cannot understand.
That's probably right. That's probably exactly right. Knowing what I know about.
I cannot understand. What is 4 months? You walk across Gaza 400 times. It's not a thing, 4 months. And we had that again and again and again, these kinds of, just a sense of incompetence. Really important for me to say this. The things Petraeus has said over the last 11 months have been the Israeli experience, have been correct. In other words, those turned out to, the things McMaster has said. America has genuine, serious military people who have grappled with these questions of guerrilla warfare. And when they talk, Israelis listen. They tend to predict the future, even when it's uncomfortable for the Israelis. You have this expertise in America. They're not the people running policy. And the Israeli experience, the people running policy, is that they'd read a lot of books in college and have no serious sense of what is actually involved, not in the combat, not in command and control, not in the question of supply, none of it. And so we were simply told by the Americans, you cannot go into Rafah until we have a plan to move millions of people over many months. And the whole thing was just American fear of their own shadow. And when it actually happened, the civilians were moved quickly and relatively painlessly. And we went into Rafah. Hamas in May suddenly started talking about actual negotiations again. It hadn't felt pressure since November, since the last deal. And so why would it sign a deal? And so much was delayed. So many people suffered because policymakers don't know what they're talking about. And when I say the Americans pressured us and that was a terrible, incompetent policy mistake, 90% of the blame, in my view, is on my government, not on the American government, right? The National Security Council, the White House generally, has to deal with Ukraine and Taiwan and Venezuela and the Houthis, popping up and shooting ships in Bab el-Mandeb Straits and 1,000 other problems in the world. My government's one job is to understand Gaza better than the Americans understand Gaza, because the Americans have to deal with a lot more things. So I'm not even criticizing them. My government should have said, no, it's February, we're moving in. We'll move them. We'll do everything we can do. We'll see whatever you have done historically to protect civilians, and we'll do twice that, I promise, at least. But we're moving in. And gotten the job done, and the Biden administration would not have stopped us. And so I'm just deeply frustrated by our government not looking the Americans in the eye and saying, you don't entirely understand Gaza. Let me explain. Some of you do, but not the people we're talking to. Let me explain what you're getting wrong. So that's how that was delayed. I have to just say something really critical here that people should understand. If you think Israel's right, great. If you think Israel's wrong, that's fine. This is true for both of you, these audiences. As long as Hamas remains in Gaza as a force that can, if not run the place, destroy, prevent, disrupt anyone else from running the place, Gaza cannot be rebuilt. Gaza will not stop suffering. The amount of sympathy there is in the world today for Gaza could translate very easily into tens of billions of dollars in aid, in rebuilding, if not hundreds. Unless Hamas is on the ground, making it impossible to do. So if there is someone out there who cares about Gazans, if you care about Israel and want Gaza demilitarized and de-radicalized and for Israelis to be safe, I'm with you. I love you. You're talking about my children have a safer future. If you want Gazans to stop suffering, that is a precondition for my kids to have a safer future as well. But just for the Gazans' own sake, Hamas has to be removed. And so all these delays that are for Gaza, they're not for Gaza. They end up hurting. They end up leaving people in tents. They end up expanding the suffering. They end up making everything more difficult.
And I want to bring us up to today now with a recent cabinet meeting and I understand that the notes of cabinet meetings are classified, but there was a leak out of a recent cabinet meeting with, and this leads up to the hostages and executions and what's going on with protests in the street recently, where Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant concerning these hostages and how this deal, a possible deal, would impact Israel's operations in that Philadelphia corridor that we talked about. And going back a little bit more, Netanyahu and Gallant, please correct me if I'm wrong, have a tenuous relationship at best. The prime minister fired the defense minister at some point, brought him back on quickly thereafter. But what happened in that cabinet meeting, and what are its repercussions?
2 weeks ago, they come from the same party, the defense minister and the prime minister. And over the issue of judicial reform, which Israelis were fighting about for much of 2023, they split ways. And the defense minister at one point came out against, and the prime minister fired him. And then there was a huge dust up and hundreds of thousands of protesters. And so he canceled the firing, and it's a whole thing. That's the sort of personal and political background. But on Thursday, 2 weeks ago, the cabinet meeting, the security cabinet, which is the committee within the cabinet that is a very important committee in Israeli law. Under Israeli law, this is the committee that can declare war. That's the body. And it includes all the major party leaders of the major coalition parties. The prime minister can't alone declare a war, is the idea. You have to have the representatives of a parliamentary majority through this committee. So the committee is in charge of all the top secret things and by law, and in fact, its meetings and protocols are secret. And also it's Israel, so we know everything that happens in these secret places. According to foreign sources, I'm supposed to say, we apparently have nukes, Israel does. Anyway, it's hard to keep a secret. There's an old joke in Israel where a Soviet agent comes to meet an Israeli agent, and he comes to an apartment building in Tel Aviv, and he knocks on the door, and the guy answers the door, and the Soviet agent says, "The birds fly south in winter." And the guy says, "I'm sorry, what?" And he says, "The birds fly south in winter." And he says, "I'm sorry?" And he says, "Are you Goldberg?" He says, "Yeah, I'm Goldberg." "Oh, I'm Goldberg the dentist. You want Goldberg the spy. He's on the second floor." Right? That's the old joke about Israeli intelligence. I'll just say at the cabinet meeting, there was a genuinely painful and very serious debate, which of course also took on a lot of political coloring, and there was a lot of distrust and even apparently raised voices. Netanyahu wanted to add to the Israeli position in the negotiations with Hamas. There's an Israeli offer. Hamas has refused to respond with an offer. There are all these intermediaries who say, no, if we just add a little more, then it'll all work out. Hamas is on board, but there's no actual Hamas statement or Hamas offer. And there's basically just been 10 months of refusal of Hamas to actually play the game seriously. They're holding on to the hostages and they're playing with the negotiations. But nevertheless, there's an Israeli sort of concept and offer. President Biden gave a speech on television in which he laid out one version of that Israeli offer. And Netanyahu said, I'm adding the Philadelphia corridor to the Israeli demand. In other words, we will not leave in the first phase of the hostage deal when we commit to pulling out of significant parts of Gaza, maybe even almost all of it, for 42 days, during which 30 hostages are released. We will not leave Philadelphia. We will not allow Hamas to resupply. and therefore extend the war and extend the suffering and guarantee that more soldiers die going forward. And the defense minister said, and the chief of staff of the army who was in the meeting also agreed with the defense minister, if we add the Philadelphia stipulation now, there is no deal, and we're going to lose those 30. And Netanyahu said, we can't let Hamas resupply. Right, we're talking about leaks, and we're talking about, I'm giving a second-hand paraphrase, okay? But that's basically the debate. And then the army and the defense minister say, we can retake Philadelphia very easily. In other words, we'll be out 42 days. Let's say the deal doesn't go to a phase 2 because, phase 2 is us leaving Gaza and Hamas returning. We take Philadelphia again very, very easily and quickly. And then Netanyahu said, what you just said was a military argument, that militarily you know how to go back in. The problem isn't going to be a military one. The problem is going to be a diplomatic, geopolitical one. And that's something I'm more qualified to comment on than you. And I'm not at all convinced that, depending on who wins the election in the US, depending on the pressure from Europe, that it's going to be so easy for us to retake Philadelphia, depending on how angry the Egyptians are at that moment. I'm not at all convinced that if we leave, we can go back in so easily and not pay a much, much higher cost than you see now, because all you see is the military question. And then Netanyahu ambushed them. He called a immediate vote on a map in which we stay in Philadelphia that the army didn't know about and wasn't drawn up by the army and by the defense establishment. And that vote passed in the security cabinet, and the meeting adjourned. That was Thursday night. On Saturday late morning, basically, the executed hostages were found by a force moving through tunnels under Rafah. And so what happened to the Israeli public as the leaks came out, as the discovery of the hostages came out, was that the military said we can pull out in exchange for the rescue of 30 hostages from Hamas. And then we can go back in. And Netanyahu said, no, we can't. And we're not leaving, even if the hostages have to die. And then hostages died. Now, the specific hostages who died were not connected to that cabinet meeting. But that sense that Netanyahu was willing to have them die for the war effort, coupled with the sense, that February to April delay of the military and the inability to go into Rafah, and the sense that the government caved at every turn to Western pressure, to American pressure, has created a sense that Netanyahu, something like 35-40% of Israelis genuinely don't think he's making decisions on the war for the war. They think he's making decisions on the war for himself, that he's caving to all pressure and just trying to survive. When the Americans say stop, he stops. And then when the far right of the coalition, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, run two very, very right-wing parties in the coalition, said to him, we're leaving the government if you don't go into Rafah. Then he goes in, defying American pressure. In other words, at no point does he stand up and take a serious Israeli strategic decision, resisting pressure. He's always caving to whatever pressure he feels most strongly, and he's willing to let hostages die, because if he leaves Philadelphia now, he loses his coalition and falls from power. 40% maybe of Israelis, we have pretty good polling on this, consistent over many months, think that he's leaving the hostages to die for his politics. That's catastrophic. That they think that is catastrophic. I think Netanyahu's right on the substance. And I am horrified and feel betrayed by his politicizing of his own leadership in so many ways, talking constantly about himself, refusing to explain the war effort to Israelis, going months at a time without interviews. But he's actually right on the substance of Philadelphia, and we should not leave. And if we show Hamas that we will actually choke them, if we, in our decisions, lower the value of hostages for Hamas, the chance of getting them out rises. And so Netanyahu is doing the right thing, and because he's constantly politicking, he is unable to explain it to a populace that increasingly distrusts him. That is what I believe is happening. One of the fascinating things is we have many different polls that ask the same question in different ways. And so we have a very good sense. When pollsters said, right-wing pollsters have polls out that asked, Hamas's version of the deal in exchange for 30 hostages. Do you support it? And something like 70, 80% of Israelis said no. And left-wing pollsters said some kind of agreed upon deal modeled on the Doha summit, which was a meeting where the Israelis kind of agreed to something. In other words, a deal that Israelis could agree to. Would you support that? And 60% of Israelis said yes. And leaving Philadelphia, the majority don't want to leave Philadelphia, but a very large majority wants some kind of a deal. When the 60% said yes, only like 12% said no. So what do Israelis want? Israelis want a deal that doesn't sacrifice the war effort and are willing to follow the government through the really hard decisions on Philadelphia, on letting the hostages die to make sure Hamas can never take hostages again. And they need a prime minister they can trust to not be politicking his way through it. That's what all the polls tell us. And, I've gotten into a lot of detail on this in other podcasts. I don't know if the general public needs to know all the details, but they're there, they're out there. So that was Philadelphia. It was a tormented moment in Israeli public life. I have to say, you saw 200,000 protesters come out. The Israelis are capable. Hamas thinks it has us. It thinks it's playing us. Hamas fiddles while Gaza collapses because it doesn't actually care about its own people. And I submit that it doesn't even understand us. We are capable of carving a path through this problem this Sophie's choice they've presented us with. And we will make sure that they don't have an ability to do that again. And every poll says so, and it's just a shame that by the time our enemies understand it, it'll be too late for them, and too late for a lot of people they put in the way.
Yeah. And I know you've thought a lot about this because you're such a thoughtful person, but the logic and the ethics and morals about these hostages and precedents involved with previous deals and what that has led to, and maybe if the ethical and moral thing is to do the logical thing long term. And I want to ask you about that in a second, but long-term implications of the Shalit deal. What is the shadow that casts now over these negotiations, and what were its consequences? And did it lead, in your view, directly or indirectly to October 7th?
Yeah, directly. In 2006, a government was elected, the Olmert government, talking openly before Election Day about a withdrawal from the West Bank. The previous August 2005, the Israeli government had pulled out of the Gaza Strip, and Israelis were willing to take this experiment of a unilateral withdrawal because after the Second Intifada, nobody believed Palestinian politics could reciprocate an Israeli withdrawal with peace. They were too overwhelmed by their own extremists and radical Islamists and all of that. And I don't remember I think the government was 10 weeks in office. It was formed in March of 2006. In June, Hamas carried out the very first tunnel operation in Gaza. It crossed the border. It killed 2 Israeli soldiers, kidnapped a third named Gilad Shalit. And that begins a saga of 5 years in which Shalit is in a dungeon in Gaza. And by the time the Israelis are willing to pay just about any price, and by the time the deal is signed, the Israelis have agreed to something like 1,100 prisoners, including mass murderers, including people with terrible, terrible blood on their hands, were released for Shalit. And they included among their ranks most of the command hierarchy that planned and carried out October 7, including Yahya Sinwar himself, the commander of Hamas in Gaza. Released in a Shalit deal in 2011. Even then, he was known to Palestinians as the butcher of Khan Yunis, not because he killed Jews, because he killed Palestinians. He was a man who was on a crusade for Hamas to kill anyone suspected of collaboration with Israel. There were no courts, there was no evidence. He killed. And he was made a hero by Hamas Hamas sort of heroicized him. He sat in Israeli prison, so he was considered this great guy. He was made leader of Hamas in Gaza, and the first thing he did, and many of his deputies who who had that close trust and had developed a sense of shared strategy in prison together, built out October 7. October 7 is a direct result of the Shalit deal. And poor guy, young man, Gilad Shalit, his name is attached to that. Has nothing to do with him. He made none of these decisions. Um, our willingness to go to the ends of the earth, to give anything, to take any, pay any cost for our people is one of our great strengths. An Israeli soldier going off to war knows that his country will do anything it takes to get him back. It has become, our enemies understood it. Our enemies are looking for our weaknesses. We don't have a whole lot of weaknesses. We keep winning one version of war, so they keep having to try another. And they have turned this into the great war against us. And so now we have to make hostages less valuable in order to protect them. And that is where Hamas has brought us. The fact that Hamas is making us turn against our most fundamental ethos. We are a nation of refugees that stopped dying when we stood up and declared our self-determination and a willingness to protect each other. And that solidarity has given us the safest time in the history of Jews. But now we have to be willing to do the things that hurt us most. And Hamas did that to us, and that is one reason that Hamas will not survive this.
And I know I've kept you already too long, and I sincerely apologize. And I thank you so much for spending so much time with me. I have a lot more questions that I'm not going to get to, but because it's directly tied to what you just talked about here, how do you make it not worthwhile to kidnap Israelis, to hold Israeli hostages? How do you make that cost so massive that it doesn't make sense anymore? And I know the logical answer to that. But for the long-term strategic safety of Israel, the logical path does not look good for current Israeli hostages, if you're looking at it from that perspective.
It's very simple and very frustrating and very painful, but very simple. There's costs and there are benefits to taking an Israeli hostage. We have allowed the cost to be low, not to Gaza civilians, not to the Israeli families of hostages and soldiers, but to Hamas. We've allowed the cost to be very low, and we've allowed the benefit to be very high. We have to reduce the benefit. We have to reduce our willingness to negotiate and pay any cost. And no hostages. We have to reduce the cost that we're willing to pay, the benefit to Hamas. But we can compensate. We can pour every bit of bitterness and grief from that side of the equation into maximizing the costs for Hamas. Qatar said to Israel, "Don't you dare assassinate Hamas leaders in Doha." And for some inexplicable reason that I will not understand till the day I die, our government has not assassinated Hamas leaders in Doha. And Turkey said, if you assassinate Hamas leaders in Turkey, Turkey hosts them. Turkey is a Muslim Brotherhood Islamist regime. Good luck having them in NATO. That'll be a declaration of war. And for some inexplicable reason, my government has not assassinated Hamas leaders and officials in Turkey. So we had to do it in Tehran, which was, I gotta admit, fun. But it's a shame he was alive long enough to make it to Tehran. And that's the simplest point of it. Every asset, every leader, every fighter, everyone in any database, anywhere in the world should be killed. It's Hamas. Hamas doesn't have a right to exist any more than Nazis do. Hamas, October 7 was the apotheosis. It was the end. It was the crescendo of one thing that Hamas has been and always been. Hamas isn't a group fighting occupation. Hamas is a group that is willing to bleed and die and kill everyone around it, especially Palestinian, to prevent peace. When has Hamas launched its major operations? In 1996, the Israeli left had founded the Oslo process with Arafat, and there was an election. Rabin had just been assassinated by an Israeli Jew, not by a Palestinian, and the left was running to continue that peace process. And Hamas carried out 2 terror attacks in the week before the election that lost that Oslo peacenik left that election and delayed everything by several years. And then the left is back in power and negotiating Bill Clinton's peace process. And there's going to be a Palestinian state, and there's going to be some kind of a capital in East Jerusalem, and there's going to be some kind of agreement on refugees and borders and all the impossible things. And that's when Hamas leads a campaign of 140 suicide bombings. Hamas's violence never spikes in moments of Israeli bad behavior, in anger at occupation. Hamas wants always to prevent the peace because the peace allows Israel to continue existing, and that's the great crime. Because Hamas is on a whole different place. It's not about suffering of the Palestinian people. It's perfectly willing to use the suffering of the Palestinian people as a weapon of war. Hamas is about a redemptive story of Islam's restoration after centuries of weakness. And for that, it's willing to kill every last Palestinian and eager to kill every last Jew on earth. Not just that was even in its charter for many years. And still. So Hamas has to be destroyed. And we can do it. In the last 2 months, we have finally begun to undertake the kind of aggressive, dangerous policy that we are capable of. We took out Hezbollah's chief of staff, Shukr, in Lebanon. We took out Haniya in the Blair House of Iran, where he's hosted by the Revolutionary Guard. And we so enraged the supreme leader that he went on television the next day and said, we're going to retaliate on Israel. And that really screwed over the Revolutionary Guard Corps because now they have to retaliate against Israel. Well, how's that retaliation going? I was asked by some international, cable news networks, are Israelis terrified of the Iranian response? 120 Yemeni missiles were shot at Israel and intercepted. And then one drone made it through and killed an Israeli civilian in Tel Aviv. And the Israeli response to the Houthis wasn't this gentle stuff that's coming from the British and from the Americans in Bab el-Mandeb Straits. The Israeli response wasn't for that one drone. It was for the 120. We destroyed their oil depot in Hodeidah, which is their major source of foreign income. And they don't have sources of foreign income. They don't even control their own currency because that country is divided. Nobody trusts the Houthi version of the currency. We hurt them profoundly. And we did it at a distance of 2,000 kilometers from Israel, which is 400 kilometers farther than Bandar Abbas and the oil installations in Iran. After we did that in Yemen, Putin released a public statement of his call to Khamenei, in which he told the world, told the Israelis publicly, that he told Khamenei not to allow the Iranian response to kill any Israeli civilians. Why? Because he cares about Israeli civilians. He doesn't want the Israeli response to take out, for example, the drone factories of Iran, which supply his drones in Ukraine. Here's the thing. I do want that Israeli response. I'm upset that Iran hasn't retaliated because we are dangerous. And we are a dangerous, strong, united people. Unfortunately, led by people not quite aware of how dangerous we can be. And I think that in the last 2 months, there's been a realization that this is a bigger war. If we want to avoid a war in Lebanon, which will be much harder for us than Gaza, because, for example, you can't close the supply lines in Lebanon in the way you can in Gaza. And Lebanon, Hezbollah just has capabilities that are 2 orders of magnitude beyond Hamas, missiles, and it has tunnels networks all over South Lebanon. It's just a much, much worse war. But you know who it's much worse for? I don't want to have a war with Lebanon because Lebanese civilians have even less connection to Hezbollah than Gazan civilians to Hamas. I desperately want to avoid that damage to Lebanon. So how do I avoid damaging Lebanon? Well, Hezbollah is just a branch of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. I take the fight to Iran. I submit to you that everything the solution to hostages isn't to now negotiate high prices for hostages. That's the problem that brought us to this place directly. The solution is to exact a cost from the enemy so very high and to be willing to escalate so very high. The former Israeli defense minister back in the 60s named Moshe Dayan said, be the wounded tiger. Nobody quite knows what the wounded tiger is going to do, but a wounded tiger will do things that don't seem to be in its interest. And its power and its strength and what is terrifying about it is exactly that. So we are capable of astonishing things. And if we can't, if we cannot pay the costs of those hostages, because we have to lower that value, let's raise the cost to the enemy of taking hostages in the first place. With every ounce of anger that we have for the place they have brought us to, let's raise that cost.
And I know we're getting a little long here, and I hope
that's
we'll come
okay.
back
I got a few minutes. No, it's
awesome.
okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'd like to have you back on at some point, though, if you have time to talk specifically Iran, because that could be a long one. And in what you just said, just thinking about it now, my thought would be that Iran possibly strikes back the way they did in Buenos Aires years ago, something, outside the region.
Sure, a Jewish community center, right?
Yeah.
Yes, these great heroes and warriors fighting the great holy war for their God. Yes, they can always attack women and children and civilian embassies and very weak targets. Well done them. We can cause real damage, and we need to start causing real damage. Hezbollah in the north has emptied the north. It has been shelling our northern cities and towns for 11 months. What the hell is that? What is that? At some point, Hezbollah is just a nutty little force of nature. At some point, it's my leadership that's the problem. How is that continuing without immense costs exacted, not the way Iran wants them to be? It wants a war between Israel and Hezbollah. It wants the Lebanese to die in its proxy war with Israel. So we don't give it to them. We go straight to Iran. There are something like 10 or 11 villages on the northern border that are completely demolished from just steady rocketing over the last 11 months. A third of the city of Metula is so destroyed by the rocket fire that everything has to be bulldozed and rebuilt. 100,000 or 70, 80,000, we don't even know the number exactly. Israelis can't go home, haven't been able to go home for 11 months. So Iran is a regime that is fundamentally weak. All dictatorships are fundamentally weak. It is weak also because it is a regime where 80% of the country doesn't want it. The Iranian population doesn't like this government, and they dislike this government so much that they're secularizing as an act of resistance against their own regime. That's why every single mass protest movement in Iran is about women's headwear, because it's an act of resistance to these people who claim to speak for God. And Iran is a multi-ethnic society. Persians are a plurality, not a majority of Iranian society. And the huge Azeri population and Arab population, they have movements that want independence and to pull away from this regime. Iran can choose to be a competent, serious country, or it can choose to spend a double-digit percentage of its GDP on this redemption fantasy of destroying the Jews and proving to the Sunni that the Shia can do what the Sunni can't, and all the other oddball, crazy garbage that have driven this country of amazing talent and history into the garbage bin of history, because they have to be these imperialists. So Iran, in its imperial march across the region, I'm sorry, I got a little annoyed. I will finish with this. has committed actual genocides that nobody gives a shit about. I'll give you an example. In 2011, the country known as Syria was 10% Christian. Look it up. That's one of the oldest Christian communities on earth. It's not even 2% Christian today. They're almost entirely wiped out. That war went the way it went because of Iran. It was an uprising against the dictator Assad, and then Iran turned it into a massive war with mass displacement and genocide of Sunnis and Christians and others. And nobody cared. There were 500 to 800,000 dead, millions fleeing. They're still living in Lebanon and Jordan, and 1 million moved to Germany. Nobody cared, and nobody stopped it, and that's Iran. So when we talk about Iran as an imperialist force in this region, it is actually destroying Lebanon and plans for Lebanon to be destroyed in the next war with Israel. That's their actual plan. And so we need to, what do I actually want from the Americans? I have a profound love for America, the same love ordinary Israelis generally have for America. When Obama was elected in 2008, we had these polls in Israel. He had 70% favorability in Israel, which was higher than in America, right? He was a rock star. And then when Trump was elected in 2016, he had 70% favorability in Israel. What's happening? Why do Israelis not understand that Obama and Trump, you can't like both, right? And the answer is they have no idea about America's internal culture wars. They don't follow it. They speak Hebrew amongst themselves, obviously. I know that's obvious, but people don't actually think about it. What Israelis love about America is the absolute knowledge, because they know their own history, that when America became the preeminent world power, the world stopped dying. This has been the period of the greatest prosperity and safety and commerce and democracy and democratization the world has ever seen. Humanity is better for the Pax Americana. Now, America is pulling back. It's expensive to run the world. I have tremendous respect for it. But America still has interests. And if America because its elites were educated, frankly, by the wrong people with the wrong ideologies, if it so loses its nerve and capacity to operate on the world stage, the world will become more dangerous. We are already seeing that. There's a report out of Germany a couple of months ago. We're now at something like 130 active conflicts, the most in 30 years. As America retreats, the world goes back to war. There is a war today in the Middle East for the future control of the Middle East. I don't know if my side is good people. You can like the Saudis or not like the Saudis. They're allied with me right now. You can like me or not like me. The Iranians are the destroyers of nations. If we can hold that line, and America can make the difference, no boots on the ground, no great sacrifice. But for example, on April 13, I'm really ranting. I really apologize. On April 13, Iran launched, in response to an Israeli assassination of an Iranian general in Damascus who was in charge of Lebanon and Syria. That was the very beginning of this Israeli escalation. The first hint of it, I think it was a test run. And when it was successful, Israel then decided to escalate more. We killed the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps commander for Syria and Lebanon, who was the man basically responsible for everything Hezbollah has been doing. And Iran decided to show that you can't do that. That's a red line. You can't kill Iranian generals. And so it launched the largest missile attack in the history of missiles. And everyone on the way shot it down. Jordan shot down drones. Bahrain, right? Saudi Arabia opened their airspace to us. And how did this great Sunni Israeli alliance actually come together in real time to shoot down this entire attack so that almost nothing actually happened? There was a little puff of dust on one airfield that one rocket made it through into Israel, and then a piece of a rocket blown up in midair fell and actually badly injured a little girl. And that was it. That was the totality of the great Iranian attack. The platform on which the Israelis and the Saudis and the Bahrainis and the Jordanians and everybody else could coordinate all of that was America, was basically CENTCOM. Every time the Iranians threaten their great threats, the commander of CENTCOM comes to Israel. I don't know if he actually has a conversation that needs to be had in Israel that he can't do over the phone, But he physically stands in Israel and says to the Iranians implicitly, go for it. That America, the America that knows it can threaten Iran's oil, the Iranians have this terrible threat that they're going to stop oil through the Persian Gulf. Well, they need it more than you need it. Threaten back. There are so many ways to be dangerous. There's easy ways to be dangerous. These are fragile regimes and fragile ideologies. And because we are so used to comfort, we don't do the things that need to be done to push back against these terrible imperialists who destroy and demolish and mass murder. And Gaza is a terrible war. And if the world is genuinely horrified at what's happening in Gaza, to the point where it wants to act, well, where the hell was it in Yemen when 85,000 children starved to death? Not 100 years ago, like 6 years ago. And where was it in Syria? Where's the Christian world on Syria? So, let's push back. Let's be as dangerous as we know how to be. We don't even need boots on the ground. The other side is weak, pretending to be strong.
Based on what you just said there, do you believe that Israel has been fighting for the last decades really on Iran's terms, and that needs to shift?
Yes, completely. We've had astonishing successes. The Mossad has been able to smuggle explosive furniture into their most secretive nuclear facilities. I want to shake that guy's hand who masterminded that particular operation. But none of that's enough. None of that's enough. You need to put the regime on the defensive. You need to explain to them that they will lose things they really genuinely value, lives they don't value. But the fundamental underpinnings of their economy, they do value. And their entire capacity to ship oil is something that's threatenable. And I think it's a darn shame that it isn't threatened. And I think there'd be a different Iran, and it'd be a different Syria war. There are sense-making elites, academics, journalists, people who tell the story of a society, to itself. And they have really failed you. They have really failed you. If the American consensus on Syria was there's nothing to be done, and now for some reason the consensus on Gaza is that there's this terrible thing and a lot can be done. If this is the pivot where America steps into every war, not with boots on the ground. You tried that. It worked out badly. It's hard to do. Don't spend that kind of investment. But in other ways, great. But it's not. It's just politics being played out on the world stage. I'm a cartoon character in their minds. Where is America? Where is America, that platform for great alliances to do what needs to be done? Israel has taken American aid, military aid. Israel has never taken American soldiers and American blood on the line. The Navy that protected Japan for generations from the Soviets and the North Koreans and the Chinese didn't speak Japanese. The divisions that protected West Germany from the Soviet sphere didn't speak German. I'm not sure what my point is. My point is there is a war for the soul and the future of the Middle East. There is a good side, there's a bad side. The good side, you can complain about and you can change and you can influence. The bad side is literally destroying nations. And I do wish the West, I'm talking here about America, I'm talking with you. It'd be nice if Europe was an actor on the world stage and not just complaining all day long. And the Israelis will fight whatever war they need to fight. Nobody else needs to fight our war for us. But if there is a sense that there is a world willing to act, you can't stop the Houthis from their guerrilla piracy against international shipping. You just can't. There's nothing you can do to the Houthis that they care about. They oversaw this mass, death of their own people. There's nothing you can do to deter them. But Iran can tell them to stop. So deter Iran. Exact cost from Iran to reopen shipping. A container going from China to Europe right now has almost doubled in price because they have to go around the Cape of Good Hope. Why doesn't Europe care? Why doesn't Europe do something to Iran? And the day that connection is made and there's a willingness to stand up, things will get better because Iran is not going to face the entire West, and Iran is not even going to, it's not even willing to face Israel. Look at this great Iranian, punishment for the killing of Haniya that never materialized. There's a patheticness to this regime, and it causes all its terrible damage because we all let them. And it's time to stop that.
And before we go, I just have to ask about it because it was such an audacious operation. The recent assassination in Tehran that you mentioned. What are you hearing about how that went down and how that played out?
There's some media reports, right? And they've been contradictory. And then the Iranians are so embarrassed that the Iranian press didn't report about it for astonishingly long hours. And then it was a missile from outside, and then it was a bomb smuggled in earlier, and it was a bomb in the toilet, and it killed him and his bodyguard, but it didn't even hit the apartment below him. And it was smuggled in 2 months earlier, and there's so many threads, and I honestly can't tell you that I know anything. Israel officially hasn't accepted responsibility. It took responsibility for the killing of Shukr in Lebanon. The chief of staff of Hezbollah had wanted Hezbollah to know that it did it, and also that it was a dare. It was, hey, Hezbollah, why don't you escalate now, right? It doesn't want to say that to Iran. I think Israel is slowly moving toward the kind of posture that I have been arguing for, but it's doing so. I'm a journalist. I don't actually have responsibility. I don't have to suffer the consequences of bad policy. The people with responsibility are moving in that direction in Israel, but they're doing so carefully and feeling it out. So it's never a sharp escalation. It's always a subtle escalation, but the escalation is clear and the escalation is continuing. And I'm very glad for that, because this current path we're on is terrible devastation for a lot of innocent people, and the path in which we exact costs from Iran is terrible devastation for a lot of guilty people, and I think that's a better path. So we're not even accepting responsibility for Haniya, and therefore also the Israelis aren't leaking information that is really, one of the great sources for my colleagues to get that kind of information. But I have to say, we're not we don't have superpowers. There's a really good reason that when the Mossad tries to implement some serious operations that involve a lot of human intelligence on the ground in Tehran, that they're capable of doing so. And that is the tremendous number of Iranians who hate their own regime. It is not hard in Iran to recruit assassins, to recruit people to lay bombs, to recruit people very close to the Revolutionary Guards, to take out a target in the Revolutionary Guard safe house. And that fact tells you something about the fragility of the regime. Or the Israelis are supermen. It could be. I am extremely proud of my people, but I know my people. They're not that amazing. I happen to think the Iranians are very fragile, and therefore we can escalate.
And I'd love to do this again and talk specifically about Iran and their influence and proxies and the way ahead there. But in wrapping this up here, because I know you got to go, I kept you way longer than I said, and I sincerely appreciate this. I'm not going to ask you to tell me how this ends because, well, I'm just not going to ask that. But how would you like this to end? What is your vision of how this can possibly end that's the best for the region?
I think that this war, if the Iran's war on us and its multiple fronts, of which Gaza is one, Hamas's war on us, which is a separate war, but they are intertwined and support each other, and the general Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which is a whole nother thing where I maintain, and I have always maintained, and I will always maintain, we owe the Palestinians a great deal. Even as we need to destroy Hamas because its version of the war is a war in which we are destroyed, and therefore they can never release the Palestinians from being trapped in their demand for us to be destroyed. I don't know if that made sense. It made sense in my head. All of these wars ultimately are an internal Muslim war over the future of Islam. And that's the most fundamental thing. There is a great and profound dysfunction, weakness in Arab and Iranian Islam today. And it is a debate that's been going on for well over a century about why they are so weak. Ever since European empires conquered them easily in the 19th century, they've been unable, their theologians, their top thinkers, to avoid the question, what happened to us? Islam used to be a place of tremendous science and commerce and prosperity and geopolitical power, and now isn't. And one of the responses that developed in this discourse of the 19th century and into the 20th century was that we used to be powerful and successful, especially in the early years of Islam, because God has a plan for history and we fit that plan. We were pious, our revelation was true, and therefore we were in sync with God's plan for history, and therefore we were geopolitically successful. And people who think that way, when they reach a point of several centuries of decline, have to interpret it theologically. And they've interpreted it as a signal that they have lost God's favor and lost their own piety and their, being in sync with God's plan for history. That thinking, that discourse produced a period called the Awakening, the Nahda, centered in Egypt. It's big, it's complicated. I really urge people, start in Wikipedia and dig through the footnotes. Okay, just go and learn. But just to give the most fundamental sense of what's happening and where I hope this goes. It produced within Islam, especially Arab Sunni Islam, but not only, a political ideology that says that if we return to piety, to a very strict piety, to a very radical piety, and if we return to that piety, we return to God's favor, and therefore we get back into geopolitical power. The signal that we are right, the signal that we are pious again, the signal that God is embracing us again, will be military success and geopolitical success. And therefore, we have to always give God opportunities almost to show that we're back in favor.
Click here to watch
by
another episode,
constantly
or
being
click
in
here,
war. We have to take
watch a
down
clip
Muslim
on the podcast.
moderates, Muslim governments that are not pietistic and restorationist in that sense. Long story short, at the heart of Hamas is this 150-year-old idea that the Jews of Israel pushed back Islam, and that's a sign of Islam's weakness. And Islam won't come back into history as a powerful force until Islam can show that it can overcome the Jews. And so Islam's redemption from centuries of weakness, and therefore the redemption of the whole world, passes through the destruction of the Jews. And therefore, it is worth destroying Gaza to destroy the Jews. And therefore, Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas, lost 3 sons in this war before he was killed. When he says he's willing for Gaza's women and children and elderly to die as martyrs in the cause, he was dead serious. He genuinely thinks he is sacrificing everything for this redemption of the world. I'll put it really simply. I'm not Muslim. I come in from the outside. I'm the other side of a war against this particular version and branch of Islam. There's a difference between the Sunnis of Hamas and the Shia of the Iranian regime. It's big, it's complicated. This version of modern Islam as a political force has to be defeated. There's another version, and it exists within Palestinian politics and Palestinian religion, and it exists within the Sunni Arab Middle East, and it is part of the drive of the Abraham Accords. It is part of why the Saudis want an alliance with Israel. It's to face down the Muslim Brotherhood extremists, the Hamas, the Qataris, the Turkish government, the party that runs Turkey, within Sunni Arab Islam. It is the idea that, again, cartoonishly simple, but basically the weakest, most pathetic that Islam has ever been is this insane campaign to destroy everything everywhere. The idea that if you don't mass murder all the Jews, Islam can't be restored. Well, isn't that the biggest insult anyone ever delivered to Islam? There is a war for the soul of Islam. Within Palestinian politics, you have a movement called Hamas that in the name of Islam's great restoration is willing to murder every last Jew, and on the way to murder every last Jew is willing to let every last Palestinian die as well. And then you also have within Palestinian politics an Arab-Israeli political party called Ra'am that comes from the very same roots, the very same Muslim Brotherhood, pietistic, awakening of the 19th century roots. It was founded. Do I have 2 minutes? I apologize.
Yes,
It's worth
absolutely.
knowing. There's a movement within Israel called the Islamic Movement of Israel. It was founded in the 1980s by a religious figure named Nimir Darwish. Sheikh Darwish started his path very much in the Hamas ideology. Hamas was founded in '87 in Gaza, but the ideas had been there a long time, and they're rooted in this Egyptian discourse from much earlier. He founds the Islamic movement in the 1980s, and he thinks in terms of jihadism and terrorism. And he's actually arrested by the Israelis. He spends a couple of years in an Israeli prison for planning terrorism, and he gets out. And he actually undergoes religiously a flip. This pietism, this idea that Islam comes back into its own if we return to God, doesn't just produce jihadists and al-Qaedas. It also produces actual just pietistic sort of return kind of movements that don't want mass war everywhere. He switches from the violent version to the nonviolent version. And when he does so, his movement, the Islamic movement of Israel, actually splits in two. The northern branch follows the Hamas line. It is today illegal in Israel. Its leader served time in prison, has called for terror attacks. Raed Salach is a former mayor of a northern town called al-Fahim. And the southern branch went with Nimir Darwish. Their main constituency is the Bedouin of the south. The same people Hamas killed on October 7th, the same people who have soldiers in the Israeli army who went to war in Gaza with their Jewish comrades. That Islamic movement southern branch basically produced a political party called Ra'am in Israeli politics. And its leader is a student, a disciple of Nimir Darwish, Mansour Abbas. And Mansour Abbas has been arguing for the last 5 or 6 years that it's time for Arab Israeli politics to accept a Jewish state of Israel, integrate into it, and come to the Jews with demands. You're a democracy, great. We want much more government budgets. We never sat in coalitions because we were torn between a Palestinian identity, our Israeli identity, our Muslim identity, our Arab identity. And Arab-Israeli is a complicated, layered identity, right? But we're not torn anymore. We're a minority in a Jewish state. Great. Now, right, budgets, attention, right, government neglect of our communities is over. We're coming to the table. We'll vote with coalitions. We'll sit in coalitions. We're playing the game. The reason that Ra'am, for the very first time, 2 years ago, sat in an Israeli governing coalition, for the very first time, an Arab, explicitly Arab majority party did so, agreed to do so, was that about 5, 6 years ago, the religious leadership of the Ra'am party, which is connected to the Islamic movement, Southern Branch, gave a ruling. And it's kind of an astonishing ruling, and I don't want to exaggerate too much, but basically, so I'm sorry for anyone who's learning anything about Islam from a Jew. Okay, please make this the beginning of your Googling, not the end. Sharia law, Muslim law, religious law, is mostly about how Muslims should behave within Islam. But some part of it, 5%, 8%, whatever it is about how a Muslim should act outside of the lands of Islam. If they go to the lands of the Christians, lands of the Hindus, whatever. The Shura Council of Ra'am gave a kind of ruling in which they basically argued that Israel was the 5%. Now, we should all fall off our chair upon hearing that, right? Because what does it mean? It sounds like I'm really into the weeds. What does that actually mean? That means that Israel is not temporarily occupied Muslim territory about to be destroyed by the great Mujahideen. It means that Israel is Jewish. It's a Jewish land right now. And when you talk to people around this group, they say, look, if we take seriously the Islamic idea, the very, very old Islamic idea, that geopolitical success is a sign of divine favor. It's an idea you see in Calvinism in one way or another as well. It's not unique to Islam, but it exists in Islam. How do we understand the absolutely inexplicable Jewish success story of Israel? The only way I can understand it, say people like Mansour Abbas, is that God wills it. Because if God did not want the Jews here now, the Jews would not be here now. I am a man of faith. Unlike Hamas, we're not men of faith. I know that this is God's plan for history on account of how history is happening, and this is what's happening in it. And that means that God wants Israel to be here now for some reason. And then when you ask, well, what reason? The answer is kind of adorable. I don't know. I'm not God. Are you God? I don't, we don't know why God does what God does. But if I accept that this is God's plan, I no longer have to mass murder children. I no longer have to destroy nations. You know what I can do? I can come to the Jews and say, hey, pay up. You're a democracy. You have rights for minorities. Let's go. Let's have that negotiated. Let's have that discussion. You're not doing enough for minorities, put it that way. And so within Palestinian religion, since Mansour Abbas started talking this way, over the last 5 years, he's given these interviews in Arabic, in Hebrew, in the languages that matter. And he said that Israel's a Jewish state, just like that. He's the first major Arab political leader to say that, or Muslim political leader in Israel to say that. My point is, since he started talking that way, his party became the most popular party in the Arab community of Israel. So within Palestinian Islam, okay, and from this restorationist, pietistic, sort of deeply conservative religious world, you have the two most radically opposed forces. You have the group that is willing to burn everything and everyone to the ground, including their own people and children, in the name of the great restoration and the destruction of Israel that it involves. And you have the group that says it's a Jewish state, God wills it. It's time to come to the Jews with demands as a minority and not just tell the Jews they're about to leave. You have the two opposite, the most, call it anti-Israel, pro-Israel. It's such a bigger story, but let's just call it that for convenience. The most anti-Israel and the most come from the same basic religious roots. And that tells me a very simple point. Gaza can be de-radicalized. Internal, authentic, real, conservative, Sunni Islam is the answer to Hamas's authentic Sunni Islam. And it can be de-radicalized. There is a version of the very same ideological world and religious world that no Jew can walk into Gaza and give them a new ideology. That's not a thing that can happen. It has to come from within them. But it's there and it exists. And we have to have that discourse and that discussion, and we have to bring Arab Israelis to the table, and we have to start talking about a future for Gaza that A, is without Hamas, because if it's with Hamas, we're going to be fighting a war forever, and don't wish that on Gaza. But B, there's a Palestinian solution to Gaza. It has to be a solution in which the Jews aren't fighting for their lives, because guess what? Then there'll be a war forever. But it is doable and it is possible. You didn't ask me what I think will happen. You asked me what I hope will happen. What I hope will happen is that we crush the one version of Islam so utterly and profoundly that it is seen by everyone, just like this version of Islam, what it did to Syria, just like what this version of Islam did to Yemen. It is seen by everyone. I don't want to do what happened in Syria and Yemen. I don't want to do 1/10 of what happened in Syria and Yemen. I want the sense of that it is pointless and has gone nowhere and only brings destruction, because it is pointless, goes nowhere, and only brings destruction. I want that sense to be clear. I have to actually destroy Hamas. And what can take root in Hamas's fall is already there, And so let's destroy Hamas. And then let's ask, they're not children, the Palestinians. They're three-dimensional people, serious, thoughtful people with deep stories and history. They know what's happening to them. Let's ask them for a solution. And they already have the toolbox with which to build a completely different future. And they don't have to abandon anything that matters to them in order to do that, except my destruction. So that's what I hope happens. And then every ounce of sympathy Gaza has garnered over the last 11 months will translate into an astonishingly good future, amazing international investment, a huge push for rebuilding, all good things. They begin the day Hamas is gone.
Wow. And we'll wrap it up on that note, but I want to thank you for being so thoughtful in the way that you approach all these issues. I encourage everybody to follow you on X, to read your work. And I'm really looking forward to you finishing that book and being able to give it a read.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. You take care, and thoughts and prayers are with you and your family. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to watch another episode, or click here to watch a clip from the podcast.